The year was 710. After centuries of being trapped in a Shugenja's wards, Nikoma no Oni, the Maw, was free at last to roam the mortal realm. A massive, muscular reptilian monstrosity, its hide covered in scales and spines, with a massive fang-filled maw and tiny eyes under a shelf of bone. This Oni Lord's appearance spoke of nothing but savage brutality. But appearances can be deceiving, and beneath the brutish surface lurked a keen and cunning mind. Like all Oni Lords, the Maw sought to wreak devastation upon the Emerald Empire. But to realize such a plan, it had to make preparations. It needed to gather strength and muster support among the monstrous denizens of the Shadowlands. It would spend between 5 and 6 years assembling the biggest demonic army the Empire had seen up to that point. It even managed to bring at least one other Oni Lord under its banner, which is pretty rare. Kinjiro no Oni resembled a monstrous jellyfish. It could paralyze with the slightest touch and secreted acid from every tentacle. But again, what made the Maw so dangerous, what would earn it a place in infamy, was not strength, but knowledge. In the year 714, a mysterious figure approached the Maw and offered it dark and terrible secrets of magic. Ever since the fall of the Kami, there had existed in the mortal realm the Oracles, mortal Shugenja who, in exchange for a portion of their humanity, acquired a kind of enlightenment, as well as incredible power over one of the 5 elements: air, water, fire, earth, and void, and thus served as the emissaries and representatives of the 5 celestial dragons. But all things must be balanced in the world of L5R, and just as the heavens had their champions, so too did hell. Hence, the Dark Oracles, fallen and corrupted humans who also wielded power over one of the elements, but drew their strength from Jigoku. Normally, the Oracles, dark or light, could not interfere in the affairs of mortals unless attacked or explicitly invited to. But it is claimed, for reasons that have since been lost, that the being that approached the Maw was the Dark Oracle of Earth. And from this fallen sorcerer did the Oni Lord learn much great and terrible knowledge that it would soon put to good use. Meanwhile, Kinjiro no Oni was launching feints and raids into Crab Lands in the latter months of 714. Nothing mentions any connection to the Maw and its plans, leading some to speculate on whether or not Kinjiro no Oni really was one of the Maw's subordinates or was just simply acting on its own. And so the calendar turned, and the fateful year of 715 came, and Kinjiro no Oni decided to take things up a notch. At the mouth of Earthquake Fish Bay is a natural phenomenon known as Shio Senkyo no Riku, the tidal land bridge. A thin strip of land that, during low tide, actually emerged from the waters of the bay and connected the lands of the crab to the west and the lands of the crane to the east. Naturally, this was one of the many border regions of contention between the 2 great clans, and both sides featured strong garrisons. On that fateful day, the western garrison was commanded by Hida Bokaru, 3rd son of Crab Clan champion Hida Banuken. The fighting was brief but ferocious, as the Shadowlands army of lost zombies and demonic monsters overwhelmed the small crab garrison. The warriors fought with the stubborn tenacity of their clan, but all seemed lost. And then, unexpected salvation arrived, as an army of Daidoji samurai crossed the tidal land bridge and fell upon Kinjiro no Oni's forces in the flank. Their leader was the daimyo Daidoji Masashigi, often described as a man of great skill, but also of a generous and talkative nature. His one great failing, to the frustration of many of his advisors, was that he often was slow in making decisions. But it seemed that on this day, there was no hesitation. He happened to be at the Crane garrison on the other side of the tidal land bridge that day, and when he received word of the assault on the crab outpost, he recognized the immediate risk to the Empire should it fall, and acted. Caught completely off guard, the rout of the Shadowlands army was all but guaranteed. And all this from an army that was little more than a small garrison and Masashigi's personal bodyguards. But that victory was bought with a heavy price, as near the end, only Masashigi himself and 3 of his bodyguards remained alive. Although Hida Bokaru was too injured to rejoin the battle, the remaining crab garrison troops rallied and pushed, driving the demons before them. Kinjiro no Oni, seeing the battle lost, attempted to flee across the tidal land bridge, hotly pursued by Masashigi and his 3 men. Then the tide began to rise and cover the land bridge, and the last that anyone saw of that deadly combat was Masashigi and his men striking at the Oni even as the waves rose to cover them all. After the fighting, though the crabs searched and searched, all they could find was the battered helm of Masashigi himself. The crab never forgot this heroic sacrifice, and years later would erect a shrine to Masashigi on the site of his last battle, placing the helmet within. It would later be said that any who wore the helm of Masashigi would be filled with his bravery and determination. And though relations between the Crab and Crane clans would always remain pretty bad, the Crab would always make an exception for the Daidoji, whom they honored as the Iron Cranes. Alas for the Crab clan, this tragic victory was but a foretaste of what was to come. The year turned, it was 716, and the Maw launched its great army against the lands of the Crab clan. It was the largest Shadowlands invasion that anyone had ever seen since the war with Fu Leng, and for the Crab clan, it was initially nothing but a cavalcade of defeats. The lands of the Hiruma were the first to feel the Maw's wrath. Now, the Hiruma knew the army of the Maw was coming, something that big just couldn't stay concealed for long. Daimyo Hiruma Tadanori kept sending regular reports to his lord Hida Banuken to keep him fully updated on what was going on. They knew it was coming, but they had no idea just how big the Maw's army was, and they knew even less about the powers of the dread being that led them. On the 9th day of the 3rd month of that year, the month of the Serpent, a violent storm broke out over the great castle fortress of Shiro Hiruma. It was only after all of the guard posts on the outskirts of the castle were taken out that the defenders of Shiro Hiruma realized they were under attack. The siege of Shiro Hiruma, better known as the Siege of Daylight, lasted 16 days. Tadanori and his warriors fought valiantly. But then, on the 16th day, the Maw employed the earth magic taught to it by the Dark Oracle of the Earth, opening up tunnels through the castle defenses, allowing its hordes to pour in. By now, the garrison was down to little more than 300 defenders, every one prepared to give his life for the Empire. Tadanori would have died with them, but Hiruma Otokogi, the venerable sensei of the Hiruma Bushi Dojo, insisted that the future of the family must be preserved, and after much argument, finally persuaded a reluctant Tadanori to flee, along with his son and a few others. Although many of Otokogi's students were among the refugees, the venerable sensei himself would not leave. "To leave my dojo I must bow, and I will never bow to these." And so the remaining defenders sold their lives dearly. Shiro Hiruma fell, and the lands of the Hiruma family were all but overrun by the Shadowland monstrosities. Soon all the lands of the Crab clan felt the ravages of the Maw's horde. Many peasants and many samurai died. But, just as at the fall of Shiro Hiruma, there were also moments of great heroism. One of the Maw's lieutenants, a lesser Oni lord known as Chizaro no Oni, led a contingent of Shadowland forces against the village of Kotaru Mura. There, it found the village all but deserted, save for one man, the governor and swordsmith Kaiu Haru. Having received warning of the attack, the swordsmith had forged 2 formidable weapons, the Blade of Secrets and the Blade of Truth, both infused with powdered jade, rendering the very steel of the weapons anathema to the Shadowland monsters. But in the end, Haru was only one man. He could not stop them all, but he did kill many, including Chizaro no Oni, and his sacrifice allowed the people of his village to escape. Like so many desperate survivors, they fled towards the one place that remained strong enough to resist the Ma's assault. Kyuden-hida, the mightiest fortress in all the empire, carved from the living rock of a mountain by the lightning powers of Hida Osanowo, son of the divine Hida, second champion of the Crab Clan. By now, all the empire was alive to the danger that threatened it from the south, but it would take time for reinforcements to arrive, and the vanguard of the Ma's army was only 2 days away. Crab champion Hida Banuken called a hasty council of war to decide what should be done, if anything could be done. But every suggestion made, even those by his trusted advisor Hida Isoshi, always ran up against the same insurmountable problem. There wasn't enough time. And then, a young woman named Kuni Osaku stepped forward. A child prodigy in the ways of magic, Osaku was only 21 at the time, but had since childhood been respected as one possessing talents of those twice her age. She had become one of the youngest people in the history of the clan to attain the rank of sensei, and now she stood before her lord and promised him that she would buy him the time he needed. And so Banuken, Osaku, and a massive army of crab samurai departed south for the Saigo River, the last natural boundary between the oncoming Ma and its hordes and Kyuden-hida. Meanwhile, several emissaries, including Hida Isoshi, were sent north to coordinate and organize the reinforcements being sent by the other clans. Besides Osaku herself, though, the most crucial component of this mighty crab host was a corps of Kaiu engineers. And shortly after reaching the river, those engineers set to work, building defenses strong enough to hold off the Ma. But not all were simply willing to wait for the enemy to arrive. The Hiruma family especially burned with the desire for vengeance, hoping to erase the shame of losing their castle and lands to the enemy. And so, after much persuasion, the general Hiruma Takezo persuaded Banuken to let him lead a small party of men to lure away a portion of the Ma's army, weakening the enemy's assault on their position. Accompanied by 75 archers, Takezo crossed the Saigo River and began launching raids on the right flank of the Ma's army. In the end, the small but daring party managed to lure away a considerable amount of Shadowland forces, drawing them northwards away from Kyuden-hida and towards the Twilight Mountains. All the while, the Hiruma harried and provoked the enemy, causing them to lose sight of anything other than to catch the impudent humans and destroy them. Meanwhile, as the main bulk of the Ma's army came into view, Kuni Osaku set to work. It was one of the greatest feats of magic the Empire would ever see. She caused the very waters of the Saigo River to rise in an immense, immovable barrier. None of the Shadowland monsters, not even the Ma itself, could get past it. And all the while, the Kaiu engineers worked feverishly to erect their defensive fortifications. But of course, this mighty spell came at a terrible cost. For every day that passed, a year of Osaku's life was sacrificed, so that day by day she grew more aged and withered. Kuni Hohiro, her younger brother, despaired as he watched his sister waste away. Of course, he would not dishonor her great sacrifice by protesting. Instead, he went to the shrine of Osanowo, one of the fortunes most revered by the Crab Clan, and prayed for divine assistance. But, in true crab fashion, Osanowo ignored his pleas, for they smacked to him of weakness, something the Crab Clan had abhorred since the days when Kami Hida himself had walked the earth. No matter how fervently Hohiro prayed, no matter how many offerings he brought, he received no response. Days passed, and at last, Hohiro left the temple thoroughly disgusted, convinced that Osanowo would never help him. Full of anger and defiance, he cursed the fortune and declared that he would help find a way to save his clan and the empire by himself. And Osanowo was all like,
"Congratulations, Milo. This is exactly what I wanted to hear."
And just like that, replaced Hohiro's left hand with one of the most powerful and revered artifacts in all of Rokugani history, the Jade Hand. A pure, holy weapon that rendered its bearer utterly immune to the taint. its very touch anathema to anything that bore the taint of Jigoku. Meanwhile, Osaku continued to hold the barrier. Even as a month passed and her hair turned white, the hoped-for reinforcements began arriving to support the Crab Clan. All clans, great and small, contributed fighters to this mighty cause, although only 2 contingents are described in any detail. An army of lion warriors commanded by clan champion Akodo Fuso, and the Mantis clan commanded by its champion Hotaka. In preparation for the fight to come, Hida Banuken bestowed upon the Mantis champion a singular honor. He gifted him the Ono of Osanuo, the great single-bladed axe that the demigod son of Hida had wielded in life. It was not just because the weapon was old and venerable that this was such a singular honor. The Mantis, who had always culturally associated themselves with lightning and storms, reverenced Osanuo above all others. What's more, he was the father of Kaimetsuo, the first Mantis clan champion. Hotaka was overwhelmed by the gift, and only strict discipline prevented him from shaming himself with a display of emotion. And all the while, the crab engineers, led by the great architect Kaiu Haruko, continued to build. At last, on the 73rd day, Kuni Osaku's strength finally gave out. Barely more than a withered husk, the Master Shugenja collapsed dead, and the water barrier dissipated. The maw and its forces surged across the Saigo River, only to come up short against a literal stone wall. The crab had built walls before. The very first iteration of the Great Wall was built during the lifetime of Hida, and which the maw and its forces had broken through easily at the beginning of their assault. But what confronted the maw now was not just any wall, it was the wall, the Great Wall. Kaiu Kabe, against whose mighty fortifications countless generations of demons and monsters and zombies would smash themselves in vain. Where once the Crab Clan Shadowlands border had shifted constantly, territory won and then lost, the Carpenter's Wall would form the hard boundary between the Empire and the tainted lands beyond for centuries. Time and again, the maw and its forces threw themselves at the Great Wall, and every time they failed. At last, the Crab Clan and its allies had found ground from which they would not be moved. There was a close call, though. Akodo Fuso, champion of the Lion Clan, was a man consumed by bitterness. During his tenure, he had lost many skirmishes with the Dragon Clan, and those defeats rankled. And so it was discovered, shockingly, that he'd actually made contact with one of the Oni supporting the Maw. In exchange for a way of undermining Kaiu Kabe, the demon promised to bestow a blessing upon Junsui, the ancestral armor of the Lion Clan, empowering Fuso. Naturally, once this was discovered, Fuso was disgraced and promptly killed by his own lion samurai. Junsui would be stored away in the Hall of Ancestors for centuries until the taint of the demon was finally cleansed. And, just to really twist the knife for Fuso, it was his hated enemies, the Dragon Clan, who discovered and exposed his treachery. Regardless, the defenders held out, and as the Maw and its forces began to tire, made their counterattack. You see, Haruko and the engineers hadn't just been building a wall, they'd been digging tunnels. Led by champion Hida Banuken, the Crab Army and its contingents of allies from the other clans used the tunnels to come out directly behind the Maw's army. Caught between the anvil of the wall and the hammer of the samurai, the Shadowlands army stood no chance. And at the forefront of this army was a special unit of crab samurai. Men who had been hopelessly corrupted by the taint, but still retained enough of their honor that they were willing to fight and die for the clan and the empire. Over the strenuous objections of the Kuni family, and especially the Kuni daimyo, Hida Banuken organized these men into a unit of shock troops, and was thoroughly vindicated on that fateful day, for it was this unit of doomed men that confronted and destroyed the Maw. With their leader dead, those few Shadowland forces that weren't destroyed fled back whence they'd come. And so the samurai of Rokugan retired to celebrate their victory and mourn the dead. Banuken was so impressed by the bravery and heroic sacrifice of the doomed warriors that he organized an official unit for such men in future, one that would be known famously as the Damned. But more than any warrior, pure or otherwise, Kuni Osaku was recognized as the true hero of the day. The Saigo River was renamed in her honor Kawasano Seigo no Kame, the River of the Last Stand, and the action in which she had given her life for the Empire and her clan would be immortalized as the Battle of the Cresting Wave. A month after the battle's conclusion, Hiruma Takezo and his remaining men staggered in to make their reports to Banuken. They had indeed successfully lured that contingent of the Ma's army into the Twilight Mountains, and in a final climactic battle atop steep cliffs had cut the enemy to pieces. Thus, the cliffs were named after the Hiruma general, and the battle was known as the Battle of Takezo Cliffs. It was a glorious victory, but for the crab especially, it was a costly one. So many had died in the final struggle, including Kaiu Haruko and Hotaka, the Mantis Clan champion. Worse yet, his body and that of the Ono of Osanowo was lost. All that could be found of him was his battle standard, which eventually became a sacred relic of the Mantis Clan. But more than life and weapons had been sacrificed. The lands of the Hiruma family were now lost to the Empire. The lands of the Kuni family were so devastated by the corruption of the Shadowlands army that they became known as the Kuni Wastes. Countless civilians had died, and the lands of the Crab Clan, never the most fertile, would remain tainted for some time to come. Even so, the Battle of the Cresting Wave would go down as one of the proudest and most glorious moments in the entire history of the Crab Clan. They had been aided by the other clans, but in the end, when it had all come down to it, it was through their stubbornness, their tenacity, and their bravery that had held off the Maw until the final blow could be struck. The skull of the Oni Lord was recovered, the flesh was flensed from it, and it was hung from the gates of Kyuden Hida as mute testament to the might of the Crab Clan. The Battle of the Cresting Wave is one of the most iconic, quote-unquote, historical moments in L5R. And it's one of the big reasons why the Crab Clan is my favorite. To all the other true scions of Hida and his followers, say it loud and say it proud. The crab do not defend the wall, the crab are the wall. It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at StudioBrainstorm.net. Links in the description.